Hi, Dale. Welcome to the Finite Podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. We're really happy to have you here. I'm sure a lot of our listeners may have heard of you or even come across your LinkedIn posts. You're pretty big on there for your hot takes and kind of controversial opinions that stir the traditional marketing pot, I would say.
Well,
So,
I'm not sure I'd call them hot takes. I think it's more like pointing out the obvious.
yeah. Hot takes on first glance and obvious when you actually think about it. That's kind of what we're going to uncover on today's episode, some of those. We're going to focus on one of your main ones, or one that you've thought a lot about. Demand generation is a fraudulent term, which I can't wait to dive into. But before we do that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself, where you've come from, your background in marketing, how you got into marketing, or even before.
So, actually, I did not fall into marketing until somewhat later in my career. So originally, I was an experimental physicist. So I did superconductivity research. That was several careers ago. Started and ran a technology development company for many years. Um, and there we did a lot of stuff that was kind of the interface between physics, engineering, and software. And so a long history involved in engineering and software development. And then mid career, I jumped into biotech on the technology side, and uh, and ended up getting pulled more and more onto the marketing side of things. Back in this was in I jumped in '99, so when the internet was still just getting rolling. Um, and but we were selling to customers where we're selling basically at academics. And so if you're in academia, you had almost everyone had been on the internet continuously since the mid to late 80s at that point. So our entire market was online. So it was very different than many other product areas. And uh, so I got progressively pulled into that. Did a stint in finance, doing doing valuation analysis for M&As, and then restructuring and recapitalization for turnarounds, and eventually had my first full-time marketing job as the VP of Sales and Marketing for about a $50 million biotech company with responsibilities across the Western Hemisphere. And uh, so in more recent years, I have been primarily working as a consultant, working with companies in both technology and biotech companies, around broadly around commercialization. So things involving marketing, but also things involving sales and partnerships and distribution agreements and things like that as well. But probably 80-90% of that is really on the marketing side, because that's usually where companies are struggling the most.
Great. Can you give us any examples of companies you've worked with, or is it under?
So a number of companies in what's called the clinical diagnostic space. So these are companies selling um, tests or instruments into the medical market for either infectious disease testing or cancer testing. A lot of these are early stage venture capital backed startups. I usually come in around the time of product launch to help them get the product launch, and help take them through that kind of initial revenue acceleration. Um, and then a number of SaaS companies. Increasingly, I'm much more doing work with technology and SaaS companies these days than with biotech companies. I've got a client right now that is in the e-commerce space. They sell um, tools for e-commerce merchants, and that integrate into the major platforms like Shopify or BigCommerce or Amazon or eBay, or Walmart. Those e-commerce merchants that have stores on those sorts of platforms, and then they have tools that integrate into those platforms. So, uh, but most of the work has been around technology. So,
Yeah, great. It seems so from your post. They seem very relatable or relevant to B2B technology and SaaS marketers for sure. In terms of LinkedIn, is that a new thing? You just started posting your thoughts and it kind of blew up?
Uh, Almost exactly 1 year ago. I had never posted anything on LinkedIn. I'd been on there since, I don't know, 2009. Had never posted anything, never written anything, and I started writing a year ago. So, and primarily because I needed to. Um, Most of the work I had been doing had relied on word of mouth and contacts within the biotech and the diagnostic industry, and those that industry has been hit, I think, even harder by the pullback in the capital markets than SaaS and technology companies have been. And so, what I needed was to be able to kind of expand my visibility, to be able to look for new clients, and and to expand outside that kind of bubble of professional contacts that I had within that particular niche within biotech. And uh, so basically, I just started writing about things that to me seemed obvious, that I thought were were things that people believe that just obviously weren't true. And and that's been interesting because because I come at this, I think, with a very different mindset. Um, uh, because I come into it with a very, very heavy mathematical and statistics background. Because having come out of experimental physics, I at one point I went back to graduate school and got an additional graduate degree studying econometrics. So very, very, heavy training around statistical modeling. Um, a lot of experience, as a software developer as well, earlier in my career, and a lot of that was developing, doing software development around various kinds of models. So you're trying to model, some aspect of reality, and and a lot of that applies directly to to marketing in the modern era, in the modern digital era. uh, and then more recently, I say more recently, this was in the early 2000s. I went through a stint where I was involved in finance, and so I so I'm also coming in and I'm looking at things very much through the eye of a CFO or a financial analyst. And so so a lot of what I see is kind of through this lens of sort of understanding how to financialize various aspects of marketing, in terms of what are these activities doing that are going to have an impact on sort of the complex financial life of the company. And uh, and just to give one example on that, um, one of the things that you see is that that's become a very standard part of marketing is this idea of lead scoring. And how do you decide when a lead is an MQL? So you come up with this lead scoring system, and and what the lead scoring system that people use is essentially just pulling numbers out of thin air. We're going to give 5 points for downloading a crappy ebook. We're going to give 10 points for visiting the pricing page. Where do those numbers come from? You pull them out of thin air. That's where they came from. They're guesses. And as a result, and what we now see is that marketers are extremely bad at guessing intent. um, and so what you see is, within B2B, the overall industry benchmarks is that somewhere between zero point 0.1 to 1.5% of MQLs ever convert to close one. And so literally, you're handing this stack of MQLs that you've supposedly scored, and maybe 1 in 500 will convert. If you're lucky, maybe 1 in 100 will convert. And so clearly you failed. and and a more financial way of thinking about that is that marketers and salespeople both, um, are essentially portfolio managers, that we're trying to decide how to invest either more or less in individual prospects, depending on whether or not that investment will pay off in revenue in a close one deal. And so you've got your sales pipeline, and I tend to think of that pipeline as extending from an initial contact through a lead to an MQL, an SQL, an opportunity, and then a closed deal. And as we move down that pipeline, every stage involves increase in the level of investment you're going to make in that particular person or that particular account. And so you are an investment portfolio manager, um, and you're trying to make portfolio investment decisions by looking at the available data. Who should I invest more in, and who should I invest less in? Because you know, if you're just doing email blasts to a cold list, that's very cheap. You know, one marketer can set that up in a day and and blast out a million emails. If you're trying to do much more targeted marketing, that becomes much more expensive. The advertising is more expensive. The effort you're making through like personalization is much more expensive. Once you pass that over to an SDR, now they're making phone calls or they're sending one-on-one emails, and so now the cost investment per account skyrockets. And at some point, some fraction of those will then be passed over to account execs, and at that point, you're now making intensive, often multi-week or multi-month investments in a single account to try to close the deal. So at every stage of that pipeline, you're making investment decisions. So how do portfolio managers make investment decisions within their portfolio? There is almost a century of history on how that is done, and yet none of that information has ever leaked over into marketing. So in marketing, we get, I'm going to guess I'm going to guess that visiting the homepage is worth 1 point, and visiting the pricing page is worth 10 points, and and when they hit 100 points, they're now going to be an MQL. This is stupid. I mean, this is the dumbest stuff. And you see the results of just how dumb it is by looking at the industry benchmarks, at how poorly an MQL represents someone who is actually actually in your ICP and is actually in market and is ready to for that investment by sales to pour their time and energy into it. And so that's what I mean by sort of financializing uh, some of these processes within marketing, is that there is a lot to be learned from how you make decisions around return and intent and value that is well honed in finance, that is just simply ignored within marketing.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I'm sure there are other sectors and areas too that marketing can learn from. I always feel like we're trying to be something that we can't always be. And it's about, I feel like a lot of your takes kind of illuminate that difference, that kind of gap between what we're saying we are and what we're actually doing.
Right. And again, that may, I mean, I always ask a question: why do airplanes generally not fall out of the sky? And it's because engineers have very, very precise definitions to the words they use, and that allows them to communicate, to one another on projects and to upper management in ways that is closely tied to reality. And and I know one of the things we're going to talk about is this idea of demand creation and demand gen. And I think this is a good example of this, where if you have extremely sloppy language or you have intentionally deceptive language, um, uh, you basically break down the ability to connect your actions with the reality of the external world. And and you end up sort of retreating into a fantasy world where you're doing things driven by your understanding of the meaning of these words that are just completely unhinged from reality. And you see a lot of that, I think, in the sort of digital marketing practices, and especially within the demand gen practices, and very specifically around this, what I think is a very fraudulent notion of demand creation. This idea that and if you go back to the history of demand creation, um, I mean, the term has been around since you know 2010, 2012 or so, at least in widespread use. So it's not that old. It's probably under 15 years old. But around that time, you started seeing this enormous access to digital data. The touch point data that we were seeing from the digital platforms, and you could this felt like it was very tangible and measurable. And you had this other thing called brand marketing that felt very fuzzy. And in fact, I mean, some of this is the fault of the brand marketers for making it very fuzzy. But uh, you had, um, you had this period to where nobody could, do attribution on brand. And so nobody wanted to, to ask. I mean, I blame this on marketers, not on CFOs and CEOs. The marketers, had so trained senior management around, we can prove where these sales came from, that they didn't want to, go to senior management and ask for money for something where they couldn't have attribution data. And so what do? You start to use another term for the old practices. And so instead of calling it brand awareness, now it's suddenly we're going to generate demand. We're going to create demand. And uh, so it was born as a lie. It was born as as literally an attempt to hide what you intend to actually do with the money by claiming you're going to do something else. And uh, but the reality is that within the sort of the marketing tribe, if you have younger people coming up in this environment where everyone's talking about creating demand, they're going to just take the words at face value. And so eventually the distorted language feeds back into distorted behavior. And so you start doing things that you think are somehow going to create demand out of thin air. And because that's what you promised, and so you start to try to match your behavior, to align your behavior with the words that you used, and so you get into this sort of distortion loop, and you end up, completely forgetting about, the original idea of trying to do brand awareness, trying to, create some awareness that you even exist in the market. And this is the thing that I see with a lot of companies I work with, is that, their number one problem is almost always not their tactics, not their advertising, not their marketing. Their number one problem is that no one knows they exist. And and if no one knows you exist, and you hope to try to catch them the moment before they buy, you're going to be a complete unknown. And one of the things that, about how buyers buy, and especially in B2B, is a lot of this is based on trust. Because, one of the things I always say is that in B2C marketing, people make buying decisions to avoid regret. You really don't want to buy that hideous pair of shoes, that pair of shoes you thought were cool at the time, but ended up really being hideous. That's regret. But B2B buyers buy to avoid blame. Because what happens within the B2B environment, certainly above about a 10 million revenue company, you start to see companies move toward group buying decisions, which means that buying is now socialized within the organization. And so, if you're selling into 5-person startups or mom and pops, then buying decisions are private. It's whoever runs the company or whoever's in charge of this one thing. They're going to look at it and make their own internal decision, and they behave then a lot more like rational buyers at that point. But about, and there's really good data from Boston Consulting Group that came out in earlier in the spring, where they, based on some research they had done, that shows that this behavior starts to end around 10 million in revenue, and by 100 million in revenue, you're fully into this kind of group buying situation. And the deal with group buying situation is you've taken private decisions and you've made them public within the organization, and you've socialized those decisions. And so now you're not buying based on what's the best product. You're buying based on what product is least likely to get me fired if this whole thing blows up in my face later. And or what product is going to keep me from looking like an idiot, and ruining my career within the company, even if I don't get fired. And so and two examples I always give. One is, if people actually bought on what was the technically best product at the best value, Salesforce would sell exactly 0 units. I mean, anyone who's ever used Salesforce, it looks like it's something that Time worked out in 1999. I mean, it is a dreadful package to use, and especially compared to a lot of very, very sophisticated, very cleanly done CRMs that are out on the market. But no one buys those. They buy Salesforce because no one ever got fired for buying Salesforce. And another example that I think is even worse is Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams has something like 90% market share within the Fortune 1000. If you have ever used Microsoft Teams, it is the biggest piece of crap product that Microsoft has ever produced. And and this is a company notorious for crap products. Um, Literally no one would be using Teams if it was based on on the quality of the product. And it doesn't come cheap either. So, but the deal is, no one ever got fired for buying Microsoft. No matter how terrible the product ends up being, you can always say, but it was Microsoft. It's what 90% of the Fortune 1, what 90% of companies that look like us buy. So, I mean, I couldn't have done any better on the buying decision. And, uh, you know, so, you really, I think, have to think about why people buy and what are the real drivers behind why and how they buy, and then align the marketing tactics to match with this. And so one of the things I always talk about is that no one buys, again, B2B purchases, companies above 10 million, no one buys based on value, period. No one. What they do is they buy on based on risk adjusted value. And the reason this is that between 40 and 60% of buying situations end in no decision, which means they have looked at every available option on the market, and they literally, have looked at them and decided that, this 20-year-old piece of crap that they already have installed is better than every available option on the market. And they're doing this, roughly 50% of the time. And what they're looking at isn't the value of the product. What they're looking at is the risk of making a change. And this is this idea of risk adjusted value. And so, so if if you're asking them to replace something that's working, because basically keeping what you've got, no one's going to blame you. um, Changing to something new that blows up, you're going to get all the blame. And so it becomes safer for them to just stick with, no matter how bad the product is, to just stick with what they've already got than to change to something new. And uh, and I'll give you a very specific example, from some companies I've worked with in diagnostics. Um, you know, I worked with a company a number of years ago. They had a platform for uh, detecting infectious pathogens in transplant patients. Um, but all of their marketing was focused on, this is the most, advanced technology in existence. This is the most sophisticated science. This is the most revolutionary platform. And all of those things were entirely true. It was, some very sophisticated science, some amazingly sophisticated engineering, and biology built into the platform. It really was revolutionary. But the problem was, and the question I asked the CEO was, you're selling this to transplant surgeons. What transplant surgeon is going to be willing to bet the life of their patient on the most amazing revolutionary thing that no one has ever used before? None. They're going to stick with what works, even if they know that what works isn't great, because what work, what's existing in use, worked good enough, and no one's going to blame you for sticking with kind of the standard. But if you take on this new approach and it doesn't work and someone dies, then you get all the blame and the lawsuits. And so, you know, very specific choices of language around what, because again, what they were trying to do was to persuade people that this was the most amazing thing, that there was high value here, without understanding that that's not going to be persuasive. You're not going to get people interested in it. In fact, you're going to get people. You're going to make sure that people are not interested in it, and you're going to make sure that people stay as far away from it as possible. because of your choice of language, because of what you imagined, as a marketer, your buyers were driven by, and what you imagine as a marketer, you think you're trying to do with the marketing materials. And this is what I mean by, sort of the words you use and represent a model for how you think reality works. And if that model is fundamentally at odds with how reality actually works, it leads you to do things that not only don't work, but have negative impact that will, actually make things worse for you. Not just, have no, not just have zero impact, but have negative impact. And so, this is why the language we use and what's implied by that language, I think, becomes very important, because that language feeds back into actions and beliefs.
Great. So you're kind of using B2B psychology, B2B buying psychology, psychological fact, really, that has been tested and proved in certain buying situations to kind of show that it's about social proof, it's about awareness, it's about targeting multiple personas in a buying group. It's about all of these different things. And I'm getting the picture that it's not about demand generation or demand creation. Uh, how does it look back to that?
Well, so one of the things that I think is probably um, one of the 3 or 4 most important principles that people should understand is this thing called the 95-5 rule that was first articulated by John Dawes, who's a professor at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which is an academic institute in Australia that does marketing research. And but there's an enormous amount of data that supports this idea of the 95-5 rule, which says that at any given point in time, only about 5% of your market is in market, and the other 95% are not in market and cannot be persuaded to come in market. And one example that I give is, and this is more applies, I think, to guys, but if you just had a haircut 2 days ago, what sort of a marketing promotion would get you to go have a haircut today? None. You don't need a haircut. You just had one. um, whatever you would get from that is not worth the time and money. Um, um, but most guys cut their hair about once every 4 to 6 weeks. Generally, between the time you wake up one morning and say, I really need to get a haircut, to when you actually get the haircut, is usually like a day and a half. If you run the numbers, what you see there is that at any single point in time, about 5% of people who are in the haircut market are actually in market. They're in that buying window between the interpurchase, within the interpurchase cycle. So the rate of purchase of haircuts is going to be 4 to 6 weeks. You've got a day and a half where you're making a buying decision. If 2 days after you get a haircut, it doesn't matter what piece of marketing comes along, nothing's going to persuade you to suddenly, go get another haircut 2 days later. And so, haircuts almost exactly follow the 95-5 rule, but you actually have to calculate this specifically for your product category. But almost all products fall within about 2 to 7% of the market is in market at any given time. And much of B2B is pretty tightly centered around about 5%. One exception is actually durable appliances. In the U.S., the average interpurchase period for a durable appliance like a refrigerator or a stove is 11 years, and the purchase window is under 10 days. Because basically, if your refrigerator dies, you're not going to spend 3 months deciding how to get a new one. You're gonna get it delivered as fast as possible. And so you've only got a fraction of 1% of the market that's in market at any given time. But that's an exception. So almost all products and services are going to be around 5% in market. And the foundational belief around this idea of we're going to create some demand is that somehow you can upset this balance. Somehow you can put something out in the world that's so persuasive that you can get someone who does not have a current active need to suddenly, be compelled to go out and spend money on this thing. And uh, you know, even if you can find rare cases in like B2B social status goods, um, there probably are exceptions out there. B2C, I mean, social status goods, Nike, expensive Nike sneakers. Um, but in businesses don't just randomly spend money because they suddenly saw, an ad on a Facebook feed. Businesses spend money to solve problems that are high value and urgent, and for which there is social agreement within the organization that it's worth expending resources to solve this problem. And and again, they're also looking at this whole idea of risk. Um, and switching cost, which is another. I mean, for especially in SaaS, many SaaS products. Now, again, there's a difference between you're selling individual seats of Canva. There's not much risk, but you also don't have a socialized buying environment because you have an individual people making the buying decision. If you're selling a CRM, you've got to get the entire organization to agree to use it or to be forced to use it. You've got to get your data converted, you got to get integrations done, you got to get training done, you got to get acceptance and adoption forced through. It is very expensive, and the cost of bringing a new product in is often many times the cost of the product. For instance, this is why money back guarantees are worthless in B2B, because the cost of everything else is so much larger than the cost of the product itself. That nobody's doing a money back guarantee for all the other things you spent to try to bring the product in. Um, so um, so what happens is if I just installed Salesforce 3 months ago, there's no way in hell your piece of marketing is going to convince me to rip it out and install your amazing CRM that I never heard of before. Now, you know, if you're very compelling about why it's amazing, then 5 years from now, which is the average interpurchase period for most SaaS products. So typically a SaaS product will survive in a company on average 5 years before there is a serious opportunity to replace it. So 5 years from now, if when we have grown to the point, or things in the organization have changed to the point that we really need to consider, switching to another product, if I remember that you exist, then, I might put you in the consideration set. But there's no way I'm going to rip out my Salesforce installation 3 months after I put it in. Um, and and if I even suggested it, people would fire me. and so um, but this is kind of the inherent unspoken belief around this idea of demand creation, is that you can break this 95/5 rule. You can break the standard interpurchase cycle that product categories tend to go through, and that you can be so persuasive that you can get someone to buy something that they actually don't need right now. And the reality is, and there's a lot of good macro level economic data um, that says this just never happens. That you do not see, you do not see something like a 5 year average in a purchase cycle suddenly drop to 3 years. Because a new entrant came into the market and they were so compelling that they got everybody to buy something they didn't need. And so at a macro level, it's very compelling. At the micro level, and I've looked at it, I've done this analysis with companies. If you come into a company and you ask, of all of the new customers you get, how long was it? How long do they have the product that you're replacing? So if you're selling a new CRM and they were on Pipedrive, and now they're going to upgrade to something more sophisticated, how long were they using Pipedrive? It's typically going to be around 4 or 5 years, which means that you're just riding, you're riding that kind of inner purchase cycle. You're riding the rate at which people are naturally coming in market, and you're capturing them as they come in market. You are not bringing people in market ahead of when they would otherwise enter the market. And Yeah, another example is automobiles. You see this with automobiles. The interpurchase period for an automobile is very, very fixed, and uh, you know, some of the most sophisticated and high cost marketing that exists on the planet is the automotive industry, and they fundamentally cannot convince people to go from a 5.5 year interpurchase cycle for a new car down to a 2 year. Um, that interpurchase cycle has been very fixed for many, many decades. Um, and the only thing you see is that it stretches out during periods of economic difficulty. So it can stretch out to 7 or 8 years. During periods where you've got economic downturn, but it never goes to suddenly to 2 years because someone's doing a lot of clever marketing, or someone has come out with a new kind of car. Um, you know, and a good example is the Teslas. Everybody who buys a Tesla did not suddenly sell their pickup truck that they bought 2 weeks ago to go buy a Tesla. They sell their pickup truck that they bought 5.5 years ago, and now they're ready for a new vehicle. And they know about Tesla, and they put it in their consideration set, and they look at it and they like it and they buy it, but they buy it because they were going to buy something anyway. And the fact that they knew that Tesla was an option, what that did was that altered their buying preference, their brand preferences, but you know, it didn't make them buy suddenly sooner. Um, and again, there's a lot of data that says that this is really fundamentally across B2C and B2B how buyers buy. And and so the whole demand gen, demand creation thing is really is built on this unstated belief that you can somehow break that cycle, and there's just no evidence that anybody can consistently break that cycle.
Hmm. I do wonder if, especially in B2B, it comes from this like sales led mentality where people think you can just go and knock on a door and hand someone a flyer and introduce yourself and then you've got a customer. And yes, it can happen, but you're right. They have to be in market. You have to be catching them at that kind of small window where they haven't just bought a car or a fridge or
Right.
a CRM. Yeah.
And especially in B2B, I mean, the other thing, and you see this there's some really good studies from Gartner, very good studies from Boston Consulting Group around about sort of corporate buying behavior. And so there was a very good study about 2 years ago from Gardner, um, that, and some of the results that came out of that was that a typical buying group will start with 2 to 3 brands um, that they had prior awareness of, and that uh, 85 to 90% of the final buying choice will come from that initial 2 to 3 brand buying set, consideration set, so-called day one consideration set, and uh, but they will typically have 5 to 7 products that will be ultimately under consideration. Um, but if you then factor in the data about the rate of no decision, which is roughly 50%, what that means is that 50% are going to keep the status quo. Of the remaining 50%, 90% of those are going to choose something that they already had prior brand awareness of going in, which means that if you're an insurgent brand and you have not developed any brand awareness and they find you during the buying process, you've got about a 5 percentage point chance of closing that deal. And you in fact share that 5 percentage point chance among all of the other brands that they're considering, that they stumbled across, that were not in that day one consideration set. And so, and again, a lot of kind of the demand gen tactics, the things that people with the title demand gen, the word demand gen in their title do all day, is really heavily focused on attracting people who are in market. I think without ever understanding that that's what they're doing. So all of the lead gen, and you listen to demand gen marketers, and they will tell you that the most important thing is building pipeline, generating qualified leads. This is how they're measured. All of this, building pipeline, generating qualified leads, all of this is only that 5% who are in market. You're going out there and you're capturing the interest of people who did not previously know that you existed, as they fall into market. And uh, but the problem is that you've basically already lost the game if you did not do the hard work up front to make these people aware that you existed long before they had a need. And and I'll give you a very good example. Um, so right now there are about 1,900 CRM products on the market. A lot of these, which is just absurd. A lot of these are overly funded VC backed startups. And and I've looked at some of these. Some of these are just astonishingly good products. I mean, just brilliant technology, brilliantly executed. There is no loss. There's no lack of excellence in that market with a lot of these products. But and there has been in the last 10 years, there's been roughly $30 billion poured into the CRM startup market, almost all of which has been poured into sales and marketing. And yet, in the last 10 years, there has not been any movement in market share position in the top 75% of the market. So 75% of the CRM market is controlled by 5 brands: Salesforce, Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, and I forget what the fifth one is. And there's been no market share shift. There's not even been any relative market share shift. I mean, the market share has been almost deadlocked for a decade now, in spite of $30 billion worth of spend that largely was funneled through demand gen operations, demand gen marketing. And so again, this is another example of sort of macro level data that indicates that these are fundamentally completely failed approaches, and they're failed because they are fundamentally disconnected from the reality that you're trying to operate in. The reality of how people actually buy, because again, if you could create demand and if product excellence mattered, um, uh, and you have $30 billion to dump on it and 10 years to do it, you would have expected at least a few points of shift in market share. And it's nothing. It just doesn't exist. Salesforce holds 35% market share and has for a decade, unmoved. Which also means that of everybody who's going to buy a CRM package this year, 1 out of 3 will buy Salesforce, no matter what. And that 3 out of 4 will buy one of 5 brands. And it was exactly the same way 5 years ago, 10 years ago, hasn't changed. In spite of this just absurd amount of VC money that's been poured into that one niche. And,
Wow.
and so this is kind of the proof that this is a deeply flawed, fundamentally failed approach to being able to bring your product to market. Now, having said that, it doesn't, there are companies that engage in those activities that grow. So, so it doesn't, just because what you're doing is flawed doesn't mean that you can't also grow. Because again, if you pour, an absurd amount of money into the market, somebody somewhere will hear you and remember you. And so you can get effects that work, even though they're different than what you thought you were trying to accomplish. And one of the examples I always give is that if you go back in in early human history, um, you had tribes that were convinced that praying to the thunder gods would bring rain. And so they would pray to the thunder gods, and right on schedule, rain would come, which was proof that the prayers worked. Which meant that they should, that they need to learn how to pray harder and pray longer, and pray more effectively. And they would do that, and the rains would keep coming. And they would see the fact that the rains kept coming as proof that the thunder gods existed, and that they heard the prayers. And so, you know I mean, of course, today we know that that's mythology, but but it is easy to do things that are completely unhinged from reality, and imagine that the results you're seeing are a result of the things you did, when in fact much of that would have happened anyway, and or would have happened as a side effect of what you were doing that was completely different than what you thought you were attempting to do. And so, simply, you know pointing to companies that have grown, that focus all their energy on demand gen, is not proof that demand gen works, in the same way that pointing to the fact that the rains came isn't proof that your prayers to the thunder gods worked. That it really has to be tied to you know to a deeper, more evidence-based understanding of how markets work and how buyers buy.
Which I think is hard when it depends on the market, depends on the buyer, depends on, like you say, it might not be all B2B. We don't even know if that distinction is really relevant when we have cameras in the room anymore. I think a lot of people would say that demand generation isn't, maybe you're taking it too literally, maybe it isn't actually about like generating demand, maybe it's more of like a tactical brand awareness with targeting and with a digital marketing lens. Why do you think it's important to get that terminology right and to all be on the same page?
So when I've had demand gen people push back on me on this, it, they usually fall into kind of three categories. So one category is, you know, of course we can't create demand out of thin air. What we're doing is we're making people aware of our brand. That's what demand gen is. And my response there is, so you've got brands that you're making people aware of. For 150 years, that was called brand awareness. So why don't we call it brand awareness? Since you tell me that is what you're doing, why do we have this sort of fraudulent term that we're generating demand, instead of just saying what we're doing, which is we're creating awareness of our brand? That's viable. And again, what happens is that, you know, in the beginning, I think that this was sort of, we're going to say we're doing one thing, but then we're going to keep doing this original thing. But as time goes on and new generations enter the market, new generations of marketers come into the field, you know, they don't necessarily know, the con. They don't know that this was all just a con job. They take it at face value and they believe it. And now they're racking their brains trying to figure out, how are we going to generate, how are we going to create demand? How are we going to, take someone who doesn't have a need and make them want to buy? And so now you get into this whole kind of, sort of perverse set of tactics that are trying to align your behavior back to your words. Where if you just said, we're building brand awareness, no one's confused by that. So the second category of demand gen marketers will come back and say, of course, we're not creating demand out of thin air. What we're doing is we're creating demand for our product, which is valid. And my response there is, the sole reason that marketing exists is to get more people to buy our stuff than to buy the other guy's stuff. This has been true for literally centuries. So you're not creating demand for your product as something special. This is marketing. This is the very sole reason that marketing exists, is to get more people to buy our stuff than the other guy's stuff. And so again, the the language leads you off to do things that are just perverse, that are just unhinged from reality. Where, if you simply said, you know, we're here to do marketing so that more people will buy our stuff than will buy the other person's stuff. Now you're getting, you're starting to tie the language closer to the things you need to do by simply stating what it is you need to do, rather than hiding behind, again, a fraudulent term. The third category of people, and this is a much smaller, this is maybe 10%, um, love to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, there are people that don't even know they have a problem, and it's our job to to and this is always the funniest for me, and our job is to convince them that they have a problem, and as soon as they're problem aware, then they'll buy from us. The only reason they haven't bought is they're not problem aware. And yeah, I mean, the world has a certain amount of completely clueless people. um, it's probably a pretty small number. Um, Most people that have a problem, if it's big enough to buy, to spend money on, at least feel some pain. Um, and if they are completely oblivious to the fact that they even have a problem, this is probably not an ideal customer to be spending your energy on. And the analogy I give is, how many of us have been in a relationship where our partner had some issue that was driving us crazy that they seemed to be oblivious of, and we informed them that they had a problem. How well did that work for you? Did they suddenly say, "Oh, well, thank you. I will now completely change everything because I suddenly see I have a problem"? No. You go through, denial, anger, depression, the full sort of Kubler-Ross cycle. Um, and a large percentage of them never arrive at accepting it. And the other thing I point out is that you have an entire profession of psychotherapists who spend years and decades trying to get someone to understand that they have a problem that they don't recognize, and often unsuccessfully. But somehow your Facebook ad, scrolling by in the feed, is going to do something that a trained therapist, can't do in a decade. You're going to suddenly make them aware of a problem they didn't know they have, and now suddenly they will buy your stuff. And it is just magical thinking. It is completely unhinged fantasy that just doesn't represent how reality works, and especially in B2B. Um, where companies, where again, buying is highly socialized within the organization, where there are lots of people that have a vested interest in not buying, as well as people who have a vested interest in buying. And you've got a complex social dynamic, and decisions are not just going to be made by random. People are going to, this decision has to survive a contentious process that is going to play out in public within the organization before a buying decision is made. And and if we don't understand how that process works, we're going to do silly, silly things. And I'll throw one other example that is just, I find it absurdly silly every time I hear this come out of someone's mouth. And in the ABM world, the account based marketing world, one of the things that you hear people just blather on endlessly is, we have to understand exactly who's on the buying committee, and and we need to have a separate message for the CEO, a separate one for the CFO. For every persona on the buying committee, we need to have a unique, personalized message. And one, the mere fact that these buying committees exist tend to be highly confidential. Who's on them tends to be highly confidential. Companies are not leaking this information out. But third, this notion that the CEO or the CFO is going to be on the buying committee is completely absurd. If and the question I always ask is, do you really think that the CFO of Google is sitting on the buying committee in charge of deciding what brand of toilet paper to buy for the employee restrooms? This is roughly a $5 million a year purchase for Google, significantly larger than most SaaS purchases. But somehow you imagine that the CFO will be on the buying committee for your product. That's a $100,000 purchase, not a $5 million purchase. And the deal is, this is fundamentally not how large organizations work. By the time you get even to 50 to 100 million in revenue, these companies are large enough that they operate almost wholly through delegated authority, that the senior leadership delegates these decisions to the lower ranks with surprisingly little oversight, and and they may continue to hold final approval authority. Although even for a larger, I mean, once you get to $1 billion company, almost no buying decisions. There's almost zero awareness of any buying decision at the C level within the company. It's all delegated down. But what happens in these companies is, you're some, even in very large companies, you have surprisingly low level staff that are sitting on these buying committees, and they have been given delegated authority, and they may come up with a final decision which may have to be signed off by a VP perhaps, or often someone even well below that level. But that person is not making choices across brands. They're taking the final decision and saying yes or no. They're exercising a veto over the one thing that the buying committee decided to buy. But what happens is that if you're seen to misuse the delegated authority, or to be incompetent in executing the delegated authority, meaning you buy a product that blows up on us and creates a lot of problems for the company, you never get that authority again. And this is how careers are destroyed by bad buying decisions in large organizations. It has to do with the structure of delegation of authority, and you keep earning the right to have that authority delegated down by continuing to make decisions that work. And when you show yourself incapable of that, whether it's your fault or not, um, you know, you suddenly are no longer going to get authority delegated down to you. Someone else will. And you know, but that VP, never sees any of the details. They're not on the buying committee. That's not how a large organization functions. And again, this sort of structure, starts to come into place, in between 10 million and 100 million in revenue size companies. So relatively smaller size companies, by 100 million in revenue, that entire C-suite, they're worried about funding, financing, financials, reporting to the board, um, you know, and long-term strategic issues. They're not worried about what brand of toilet paper we're buying or which CRM we buy. Um, and so again, it's this sort of just complete fantasizing about how you think you would like the world to work, as opposed to going out and figuring out how the world actually works and then operating within the constraints of reality.
Okay, great. So now that we've completely torn apart demand generation, I don't think anyone believes in it now, and let's hope that this spreads. Um, and we've also identified some of the realities of B2B buyers, their psychology, their thoughts, their risk aversion, and also like the social situations that they find themselves in. What should marketers do? I want to ask you, what would what would the world look like if we never had the term demand generation? If we called things how they were and sold to people the way that they buy?
I mean, I think that, you know, more fundamentally, the question comes down to, you know, everything that marketers do is based on a model of reality. So we've got these ideas of how we think reality works, and so we're operating not against reality, but against a model. So demand gen is a model, ABM is a model. Um, the question is there sort of evidence-based facts about how markets work and buyers buy, and can we align ourselves with a core set of principles that are evidence-based? And the fact is that there is a completely disconnected universe of people who do marketing research or research about marketing, mostly in academia. They write terrible, impenetrable papers that no one can read, not even other academics. But none of this stuff ever leaks out into the practice of marketing, which is interesting because it's very different than engineering. So, for instance, in engineering, there's a lot of advancements going on in academia and engineering, and that very rapidly translates into the practice of engineering. That there's a strong kind of two-way flow of information there between academia and the practice of professional engineers. There is no flow of information between you know academics studying marketing and practicing marketers, and I think that's the gap that needs to be bridged. And the closest we've seen to that, literally in the last 20 years, has been Byron Sharp, and who is he's an academic out of Australia. He's the director of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, and he's the author of a couple of great books called How Brands Grow. And that is basically taking, each of those books is taking 20 to 50 years worth of academic research around, evidence-based research around how buyers actually buy and how markets actually are structured, and sort of condensing this into a shorthand book. It's not ideal. I think that there is a better version of that book yet to be written, but it's a great book, and every marketer should start by reading that book. And a lot of that book is based on even earlier work that goes back into the 1950s by a guy named Andrew Ehrenberg, that the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is named after, around this thing called the NBD Dirichlet model of consumer buying behavior, that we now have a half a century of really solid research that says that this model that Andrew Ehrenberg developed very, very closely matches how buyers actually buy across both B2B and B2C. And uh, so I think you've got to start with some basic first principles. And one of these is the 95-5 rule. Not everybody is in market all the time, just waiting to be persuaded. And, so in one example of what happens if you don't believe, these sort of evidence-based principles is you do really dumb things like lead nurturing, because the underlying concept of lead nurturing and lead scoring is that everybody's always in market all the time. They just haven't been persuaded hard enough to buy yet. That's the only reason they haven't bought. They just haven't been persuaded hard enough. And so we're gonna turn the spam cannon on them, and hit them with retargeting ads and 50 times a week, and email campaigns and all of this other stuff. And every time someone creates a touch point, an attribution point, we're gonna give it a score, because that score represents how close we're pushing them to the edge of the cliff before we're ready to tip them over the edge of the cliff into sales. Um, and so the entire concept behind lead nurturing and lead scoring is that everyone is always in market all the time. And all we have to do is just persuade them hard enough, and we can force them into market. And so this is just one example of how an entire category of tactics is predicated on not understanding a single fundamental principle, for which we have decades of evidence for. Um, so, another one that I think is very important, especially in the digital era, is what's called the ad response function. And again, research on ad response functions go back to the late 1950s. Um, and so what the ad response function says is that when we see an ad, how does that ad alter our propensity to buy? Typically over a near-term period, from 2 weeks to 6 months is usually what they're looking at. And what research has shown now for literally 60 plus years is that the first impression of an ad has the greatest impact. Typically 90% or greater influence on your propensity to buy is the very first view of the ad. That curve then flattens out very quickly. And so even if you show them the ad 100 times, all you're going to gain is a few percentage point increase of propensity to buy above what you had achieved by the first time you shown them the ad. Now, again, you people forget, so you have to come back and you have to refresh those memories over time. Although the refresh cycle is typically on the order of weeks to months, not days or hours. Uh, but instead, what you get is an entire multi-billion-dollar industry of ad retargeting, which is completely absurd. And every every attempt to measure the effectiveness of ad retargeting has shown that it is a complete total waste of money, because in ad retargeting, what you're doing is you're doing advertising to try to expose people that aren't aware of you or don't remember you. That's the coal layer. Then you're taking people who have shown clear behavioral evidence that they saw and consumed that ad. So they watch 90% of the video, or they click through the ad, and spent more than 60 seconds on the pricing page or on the product page. So you're using behavioral triggers that provide full evidence that they fully saw and consumed the ad. And then you hit them with the ad 50 more times, or 100 or 150 more times over the next 90 days. And you're spending a lot of money on every one of those hits. And what you're not doing is you're not spending that money on showing ads to people that don't know you exist. And what you see when you do incremental lift studies, so you ask the question of the people that bought after being hit by the retargeting campaign, would they have bought anyway? And there are ways that you can set this up. So there are what I call holdout studies that you can do, and almost every retargeting platform has some ability. It's not built in, but it's not that hard to do. They've got some ability to set up a holdout group that you can compare against. So you can say, of all of these people who came out of the coal layer and met the retargeting conditions, meaning that we know they saw the ad in the coal layer, um, we're going to take some fraction of them and not show them the retargeting ads, and we'll take another fraction and show them the retargeting ads, and then we'll look at their buying behavior over the next 6 months. And what you see is there's no difference. That the money you spent on blasting someone with 50 copies of the ad made no difference. And it doesn't matter if it's the same ad, because this is the other argument that retargeting people will make, is that, oh, we're not showing them the same ad, which is mostly a lie, but we're showing them different ads that are describing different aspects of the product. Turns out it doesn't matter. What worked was you took them from a state of either not knowing or not remembering that you existed to a state of knowing. And that was the magical transformation. And almost all of the propensity to buy that you've generated by that ad has now occurred with the first viewing. And, and so not only are you completely wasting all of the money on the retargeting campaign, but you're also paying a high opportunity cost, because, is it better to take one person that you know for sure who's seen your ad and show them 50 more ads? Or is it better to take 50 people who don't know you exist and show them, each one copy of the ad? And the answer is always, you're better off showing 50 people that don't know you exist, an ad that lets them go from not knowing to knowing, than it is to keep slamming people. And again, we only have to be introspective. We only have to look at our own behavior, because we've all been on the receiving end of retargeting. Did seeing that ad 50 times, following us around on the internet, make us, long ever harder to own that thing? It didn't. It just pissed us off. It's just irritating. And so, but again, this marketers tell themselves a good story that sounds convincing, but it's all in kind of a made up model that is completely disconnected from decades of evidence-based research that's out there available to us. But I think if marketers simply believe the 95-5 rule and understood how the ad response function worked, those two things alone would eliminate 90% of the tactics out there and would completely reform them into much more effective tactics. And this is just two of a wide range of tactics. I'll throw one other out: customer marketing. So we're going to do a targeted campaign um, to an account that is coming up for a renewal in 60 days. And these are very expensive ads, because the tighter you target, the more expensive the ad platforms, the more the ad platforms charge you. Why are you hitting them with 50 ads in the 60 days before renewal? Well, and the answer that you get is, well, we want to make sure that that they have all the information they need to understand why it's important to renew, so that they don't churn. But the deal is again, if you go back and you look at the evidence, once you have lived experience with the product, um, nothing that marketing ever said in the past or will ever say in the future has any impact on your affinity for the product. It's your lived experience with the product that matters. Um, and uh, and the problem is that most people that churn either because they hate your crappy product, or they no longer have a need for your product, no matter how good it was. Um, and nothing that you're going to say in a customer marketing campaign is going to change their minds. It's just pure gaslighting. And you know, and again, if people would just show some introspection about their own experiences, I think they would see this. You know, if if you get in a relationship with someone and they turn out to be a complete sociopath, but they keep pointing back at how great their dating profile was. It's like, no, what you said in the dating profile no longer matters. It's my lived experience with you that matters. I'm, and don't keep showing me the dating profile. It doesn't matter, because I know who you are now. And this is the same with products. It's like, once we have lived experience with the product, we know who you are now. And if you try to tell us, oh, your lived experience with the product isn't real, what you really experienced was this other thing. It's like, you're a psychopath. Um, and yet this is what companies do over and over again, because they're not thinking through the deeper underlying psychology of how people process experiences and make decisions, and how they see the world from the other side of the screen.
Yeah. And it's quite easy from those examples that you've just given to see how important it is to rid marketing in the sector from these fraudulent terms, because a lot of those were based on the idea that you can actually push someone down a funnel through retargeting and sell to them, make them do something that they ultimately just aren't going to do, like generate demand. So
Well,
thank you for that. Oh,
yeah, and one of the arguments that the retargeting crowd always makes is no, retargeting works. We can show that we have the highest conversion rates and the best ROI from the retargeting layer. That is much better than what we're getting from the cold layer. And of course, what this ignores is, were they going to buy anyway? Did you do a lot of expensive things that made no difference in whether or not they were going to buy? And because the deal is, if they're already clearly showing interest in the product, it means they're probably in market, and that they're probably considering you already. So, which means that most of those people were already going to buy anyway. And the um, the example I always give on this, and this goes back to a larger discussion of why marketing ROI is a completely worthless metric to be using to justify what you're doing. One of the examples I always give is, if I'm the head of marketing for a restaurant, what is the highest ROI campaign I can possibly run? The answer is to stand next to the hostess stand, handing out 50% off coupons, good for that night, for everyone who walks in that already has a reservation. I've got near zero cost, 100% conversion rate, tens of thousands of dollars of marketing attributed revenue. It is a brilliant campaign. It is the ultimately highest ROI campaign I can possibly run as the head of marketing for that restaurant. Everybody wins except for the business, um, because they're going to buy anyway. And uh, and so this is the question that no one asks: is were they going to buy anyway? Have we already done what was necessary to give ourselves the best chance we could for them to buy? Um, and should we spend the money instead of lavishing more money on people who are already likely to buy? Should we spend that money on people who don't know we exist? And that's a very, very core question around how do you make investments in marketing. And the marketing attribution tends to push people to consistently make the wrong decision because you're measuring the wrong things, and you're measuring against a mental model of how you think things are working rather than how things really work. And so again, this is this idea of intentionality and revenue incrementality. Meaning, did marketing create revenue that would not have come in the door anyway? And that's a very challenging thing to measure. And so a lot of a, 95% of marketing ROI numbers that get reported to upper management are completely made up, bogus, random bullshit. And the reason why is that marketing has a very long effect, because and this ties back to the 95-5 rule. If you can, in a given quarter, if you could magically put your ad in front of 100% of the people in your ICP, only 5% of those are going to be in market that quarter. Another 5% next quarter, another 5% the next quarter, another 5% the next quarter. So most of those ads are not going to have any impact in the current quarter, but they actually will have impact in, progressive future quarters. Now, again, you've got memory decay going on as well, but typically current period marketing is going to have incremental revenue impact over subsequent quarters, 2 to 6 quarters into the future, um, which also means that a large part of the revenue we got this month didn't come from this month's marketing. It came from marketing we did last month, month before, the month before, of people who saw us, and then they came in market and they remembered us, and so now we're in the consideration list. Um, and so you have these are called lag and latency. So a lot of the revenue happens from latent effects that came from marketing you did in the past. A lot of the marketing you do now, those effects will lag off into the future. And then the other issue is that even if you shut marketing off entirely, revenue would still come in. Maybe not as much, but a lot. And there have actually been studies done, again, going back to academic studies, and there's a very good paper from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute specifically looking at companies that had cut off all marketing for various reasons. And you do not see significant revenue impact until you're out around 18 to 24 months. That the revenue just keeps coming in because people are renewing, people are talking to other people, people are changing jobs and going, that have had lived experience with your product, and now they're in another company. And so what that means is that a lot of the revenue has nothing to do with marketing. So if you want to do a marketing ROI, it's like, what fraction of the marketing dollars we spent over the last several months, generated revenue, and then what amount of, what fraction of that revenue was actually influenced or would have occurred anyway. And the problem is if you cannot measure the lag and the latency on your marketing spend, and you cannot measure revenue incrementality, you cannot produce an ROI number that is anything other than just, a number that fell out of a random number generator. You're reporting just complete bullshit numbers to upper management when you try, when you do the typical thing of, we're going to take everything we spent this month in marketing and, divide that by all the revenue that came in this month. You may as well just save yourself the trouble and just, plug it into a random number generator and just deliver that number instead, because it would be no less unreal than the number that you reported. And the other problem is all of the ad platforms do this because it's in their interest to give you false numbers to report. Um, and you know, and if you look at the the ROI of your Facebook ads and your Instagram ads and your LinkedIn ads and your Google ads, um, and you literally tuck the numbers they gave you, marketing should be responsible for like 400 or 500% of revenue. Um, and clearly marketing is responsible for maybe 25% of revenue, maybe 50% of revenue. And so again, this whole use of ROI is a really, really fraudulent technique. And it really, and again, what you're seeing is people in finance, the CFO, the board, the CEO, you know, are coming to a point to where, their gut instinct is that these numbers are all bogus. They may not be able to know why they're bogus. They may not be able to step through the explanation I just stepped through, but they know they're bogus because they know that I'm looking at what the business is doing and it's completely out of alignment with what marketing claims. And uh, so again, I mean, it's a form of gaslighting. You're trying to say, no, no, Mr. CFO, ignore, you know, the bank statements and the financials, your lived experience of the business. This is what really is happening. And, and it is trust destroying, and which is why, marketing has a real trust issue right now. And there's a lot of this like that, and so, but there are certainly other ways to measure the value of marketing that I think would resonate with financial people and would resonate with senior leadership. Um, but it tends not to be how marketing is measured. And the thing about marketing is another great line that is, again, I think very bogus, is that marketing isn't an expense; it's an investment. No, no, marketing is an expense. It is 100% totally an expense because no marketer anywhere ever walked into the CFO's office with a check from a customer. Salespeople do that. Um, every company with a sales organization. Again, there's some differences if you're e-commerce and that sort of thing, but for a lot of serious companies that are going to grow, they have a sales organization, and marketing makes the sales organization more efficient and more effective, and in ways that you could not do by trying to do anything within the sales organization. And one example is that if I am, if I'm the head of a company and we decide we want to double revenue next year, and all I have to work with is sales, I am probably going to need twice as many sales reps. Um, because I'm probably not going to be able to magically make each rep close twice as many deals a month. Um, so if I want to close twice as many deals, I'm going to need twice as many reps. So there's a very linear relationship between how much revenue we want to generate and how do we scale sales to accomplish that. But the alternative is we could put money in marketing, and if marketing could bring people to us that are already close to being ready to buy, and the sales team could sort of close the deal, push them over the edge, um, then two things happen. One is sales has to spend a lot less time cold calling and prospecting. They could be focusing on people who already are in the buying process, and if done well, they could close at typically a faster rate and a higher close rate, simply because marketing is successfully bringing them people who are in market or likely to buy from us and are already somewhere in the buying process and already has some prior brand awareness and brand trust. And so all of this is a nonlinear accelerator for what sales is doing. And so the idea is, if we want double the revenue, if done right, we can put some money in marketing and not have to double the size of sales and be able to still double revenue. And so this is how marketing is not an investment. It is not, it is a pure cost center, but it is a cost center that has value. And just because it's a pure cost center doesn't mean it doesn't have value. And the analogy I give is What's the ROI on the building that houses your factory? It not only is it not zero, it's less than zero. You got to build this thing before you can ever use it, and then you got to just keep pouring money in it forever to do the maintenance on it, and it never puts a dollar in the bank. So this thing clearly has a negative ROI. So why aren't all factories just built out in the open in the middle of a field? And the answer is because CFOs aren't idiots, because they understand that there are other valuation mechanisms other than showing me an ROI calculation. And they know that that building has value because it takes other assets and makes them both more efficient and more effective. Um, because having that factory in a building means that your machines don't rust as fast. You don't have to replace them as often. You don't have to repair them as often. They're not down as often. The workers are more productive. The factory doesn't have to shut down every time it rains. You're taking all of those investments in a separate part of the business, the labor and the machine tools in the factory, and you're making all of them both more efficient and more effective, because you put a building over them. And so a lot of ways, marketing is like the building that houses the factory, and the factory is the sales organization, and to some extent product development, because again, marketing is a sort of nonlinear driver of value for your investments in product development as well as in sales. And it takes all of these things and makes them more efficient and more effective and brings value to the business, completely independent of any kind of ROI calculation that you might bogusly come up with. And but it's a very different, and again, this goes back to the early part of the conversation. um, this idea that it's important to look at marketing at least somewhat through a financialized lens, because ultimately you're going to have to be able to describe the value of what you're doing, the value that you're going to bring to the business by spending this money, in ways that are going to make sense to the business and make sense to the CEO and the CFO. And the language of business, isn't multi-touch attribution. The language of the business is finance and financials and financial analysis. And uh, to the extent that you want a seat at the table with the grown-ups, you have to speak the language of the grown-ups, and that language is finance, not not multi-touch attribution, not brand woo-woo stuff. It is, we're going to give you some money and we want some value back for what we, for having given you the money. It's a very, very hardcore transaction. We're not doing art here. We're doing commerce. And, uh, and marketers have to think in those terms, because that is the hard, harsh reality that you live in when you're doing this inside a business. And, if you don't like that, go off and be an artist. Then you don't have any of those constraints, or those paychecks. But if you're operating in commerce, you have to operate inside the reality of what it means to be in a business. And that is thinking in terms of these sort of valuations and valuation analysis, and your fiduciary responsibility to properly invest the resources that have been given to you, in ways that will maximize the impact on the business. And so again, going back to the early part of the conversation, marketers have to think of themselves as portfolio managers making portfolio investment decisions with the accounts and the individuals that are within the pipeline. Where are we going to spend more money or less money to try to maximize net incremental revenue for the business? And that's a very, very financial way of thinking about things. And you're
Great.
not going to get there by just, you know, pulling numbers out of thin air that visiting the pricing page is worth 10 points. That is kindergarten stuff.
Cool. So, great. There's a lot to process there. Marketers need to reset expectations, stop over promising, stop delivering random numbers. And ultimately, through the theme of this conversation has been to ground themselves in reality, not only for the buyers, but for their stakeholders as well.
Yeah,
So thank you so much, Dale. We have to wrap it up there. I really appreciate
it's
you
been
coming
fun.
on. I hope all of your hot takes in quotation marks have been turned into obvious statements about marketing. And I hope people continue to ground themselves and ground their marketing in the research that Erin Bass and yourself and everyone is doing as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great.